Cedar Ridge, Montana Territory, September 1885. They said a woman past 25 with no ring on her hand had missed her season, like wheat left too long in the field. By 28, Eliza Rose Hartley had heard every version of that whisper the town could invent, and she had learned to carry a pie through a churchyard without breaking her stride at any of them. The harvest social filled the yard behind the little white church with the smell of wood smoke and cinnamon, long tables dressed in gingham, lanterns not yet lit against the blue evening. Eliza set her dried apple pie among the others, straightened the collar of her one good dress, and felt the familiar prickle of eyes turning toward her and away again, like fish scattering from a shadow on the water. "There's the Hartley girl," Mrs. Pruitt murmured to the circle of wives near the punch bowl, not quite low enough. "Keeping that whole place going herself. Lord knows no man's fool enough to take on a farm and a spinster. Besides," Eliza's hands did not shake as she smoothed her apron. She had buried a fiancé to fever 6 years back, buried her mother the winter after, and buried whatever softness the town expected a young widow-in-waiting to show. What remained was work, and Charlie and Aunt Prudence's failing eyes, and a farm that did not care what the ladies of Cedar Ridge whispered, so long as the fences held. She did not see the stranger until he was nearly beside her. He'd ridden in the week before, new hand, some said, drifting through for horse-breaking work, though nobody had yet placed where from. He was tall in the unhurried way of men who'd spent more time with animals than people, hat in his hand now, dust from the road still on his boots despite the churchyard grass. "Miss Hartley." His voice was quiet, but it carried the way a dropped coin carries in a silent room. Every head within 20 feet turned. Eliza felt her spine straighten. "Mr. Calloway? Nathaniel Calloway." He did not look at the wives by the punch bowl, though he surely heard them go still as fence posts. He looked only at her, plain and steady, as if the churchyard held no one else worth minding. "I'd be obliged if you'd sit with me at supper tonight." The lanterns had not yet been lit, but Eliza swore afterward she felt every one of them flare at once inside her chest. Somewhere behind her, a fork clattered against a tin plate. Mrs. Pruitt's mouth hung open around a word she never finished. Eliza Rose Hartley, 28 years old, called quiet, called spinster, called past her season by half the town, looked at this dust-worn stranger and heard herself answer, clear enough for the whole yard to catch. "I reckon I would, Mr. Calloway." Nobody in Cedar Ridge forgot that supper. Fewer still understood that evening that it was only the first small stone dropped into water that would not stop moving for a long while yet. Winter did not ask Cedar Ridge for permission before it came that year, and neither did Nathaniel Calloway ask permission before he started fixing things. It began with the well pump. Eliza came out one gray October morning to find the handle no longer shrieked like a dying goose with every stroke, the leather gasket replaced, the whole mechanism oiled smooth as a church hinge. She found Nate leading a green colt in slow circles around the corral, hat low, saying nothing about the pump at all. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Didn't take long." He didn't look up from the colt's lead rope. "Charlie tell you the gate hinge is loose too, or was he saving that for winter when it'd freeze shut and teach you a lesson?" It was the kind of thing a man said instead of the things he meant, and Eliza was beginning to understand that Nathaniel Calloway rarely said what he meant out loud at all. He mended what needed mending, and let the mended thing speak for him. He came by twice a week that first month, ostensibly to work the colt Charlie had begged the neighbor to let him try his hand with, though the colt seemed to need considerably less attention than the porch step, the woodpile, and the loose shingle over Aunt Prudence's window. Prudence, half blind these 5 years and sharper of ear for it, took to having him read from the family Bible of an evening, her thin hand finding his sleeve to guide him to the right psalm, as though she'd known the shape of his patience before she'd ever heard his voice properly. "That boy's got good hands," she told Eliza one night after Nate had gone. "Quiet ones. You mind quiet hands, Eliza Rose. Loud men break things they don't mean to." Eliza only banked the fire and said nothing, though something in her chest had gone soft and unfamiliar, like a wound she'd forgotten was still healing. She noticed, too, the whittled horse that appeared on Charlie's windowsill without a word of explanation. A small bay mare, mane flowing, one foreleg lifted mid-stride, carved with the patience of a man with long nights and no one to show the work to. Charlie carried it in his coat pocket for a week straight, showing every boy at the schoolhouse, though he never once said where it had come from. He didn't have to. Eliza had seen the fresh shavings swept into a neat pile behind the barn, and the pocket knife Nate kept sheathed at his belt. And she had learned, by then, not to ask questions a man's hands had already answered. It was the same on the Sunday the buggy wheel cracked outside the general store. Eliza and Charlie stranded in the cold with a half-loaded wagon and an audience of townsfolk pretending not to watch. Nate had appeared within the quarter hour, said only, "Hold the brake," and had the wheel off, the split rim wedged and bound with wire, and the wagon rolling again before Mrs. Pruitt had finished speculating aloud as to how the two of them had come to be in town together at all. If courting had a season in Cedar Ridge, it was meant to run through parlors and porch, swings, chaperoned suppers, and hymnals shared at church. Nathaniel Calloway courted through fence posts and gaskets, and a wooden horse left where a boy would find it. And Eliza, who had spent 6 years building walls out of practicality, because feeling had cost her too much once already, found the walls did not hold against a man who never once asked her to lower them. But Cedar Ridge's ground did not stay soft for long that autumn, and neither did Silas Grady. The trouble with Willow Creek had simmered 2 years before it came to a boil. The creek ran the boundary between Hartley land and the sprawling acres of Grady's Circle G, and every Hartley since Eliza's grandfather had watered stock from it under an old handshake arrangement, an understanding, never quite a deed, that both families had honored since the territory was younger than most men living in it. Silas Grady had never honored anything he didn't have to. By November, the flow past the Hartley fence line had thinned to a trickle even the ducks complained of. Eliza walked the bank herself one frost-bitten morning, counting the inches the water had dropped since harvest, doing the arithmetic every rancher's daughter learned before she learned her letters. Less water meant fewer head through winter, meant a spring with nothing left to sell, meant a debt at the mercantile that wouldn't wait for Willow Creek to remember its manners. "He's diverting it upstream," Nate said, crouched at the creek bed with mud past his boot heels, studying the water like it might confess something. "Built something up past the ridge. I'd bet my saddle on it." "Bet your saddle on it to who?" Eliza's voice carried the particular exhaustion of a woman who had already lost one argument with Silas Grady that year, over the north pasture he'd wanted for a song. "There's no deed on that water, Nate. There's a marshal 6 miles off and a handshake 50 years old. Grady knows exactly which one wins in a territorial court." Dutch Malone came calling not 2 days later, riding up the Hartley lane with 2 Circle G men flanking him, like he needed an escort to deliver a letter. He didn't dismount. "Mr. Grady's willing to buy the North 40, Dutch said, folding the offer paper without opening it, already certain of the answer. "Generous price given the water situation. Might be the creek runs easier for them that's reasonable about boundaries." "Might be," Eliza said. "You tell Mr. Grady the Hartley boundaries stood since before Circle G had a name." Dutch's smile was thin as a knife's edge. "Might be it won't stand much longer, Miss Hartley. Winter's coming. Cattle need water same as crops." It was Nate who stepped his horse between Dutch's mount and the porch rail, without seeming to hurry, without a word of threat in his voice at all. "Ride on, Malone." Lady gave her answer. Dutch's eyes cut to him with new interest. the look of a man recalculating a piece on the board. Didn't realize Circle G's own hired man had taken up residence on Hartley land of an evening. The words landed exactly as they were meant to. 3 days later, Nate was let go from Circle G entirely, no reason given beyond Grady's own clipped assessment, delivered through Dutch. A man couldn't ride for 2 brands at once, and Circle G didn't pay wages to a hand who chased Hartley skirts instead of Hartley strays. Eliza expected him to leave then. Drifters drifted. That was the nature written plain in the word. And something in her braced for it, the way she had learned to brace for every departure the last 6 years had handed her. Instead, Nate showed up the next morning with his bedroll and asked where she wanted the woodpile split. "You don't owe us your winter, Nate," she told him, standing in the yard with her arms crossed against the cold, half daring him to agree with her. "Didn't say I owed it." He hefted the axe from where it leaned against the shed. "Said I'd split wood. Man's got to be somewhere." He stayed through the worst of it. He was there the night old Bessie the milk cow went down calving breech in a barn, lit only by lantern and Prudence's shaking hands, holding it steady. Nate's arms, in past the elbow. Low words to the animal that Eliza would remember longer than she'd admit. Not soothing exactly. Just steady. The way a man talks to something he intends to see through no matter the hour. He was there when Charlie took a fever of his own in December, and it was Nate who saddled up through sleet to fetch Doc Simmons from town, the 2 of them riding back with the doctor's black bag lashed tight against the wet, while Eliza sat pressing cool cloths to her brother's forehead and prayed to a God she'd stopped speaking to freely since her mother's grave. Doc Simmons pronounced it nothing worse than a hard chest cold by the time he'd unpacked his bag. But the fear had already done its work on Eliza, and it was Nate's hand she found gripping her shoulder in the kitchen afterward, and Nate's voice low, saying only, "He'll mend. Boy's got your stubbornness in him." That let her breathe again. Then came the blizzard that shut the Bridger Pass entirely. It arrived without much warning, as the worst ones always did. A sky gone the color of a healing bruise, then wind, then 3 days of snow piled higher than Charlie's head against every north-facing wall. No way into town, no telegraph line reaching this far from the wire station, nothing but the 4 of them and what stores Eliza had put up through autumn. Flour and salt pork, coffee beans rationed by the spoonful, thick wool blankets pulled close against a cold that found every gap in the cabins chinking. Nate split kindling by lantern light so there'd be dry wood enough to last, and read aloud from Prudence's Bible when her eyes tired too quick to manage the small print herself, and taught Charlie how to whittle a straight edge without taking off a finger, and said little else the way he never did. It was on the 2nd of those snowbound nights, with Charlie and Prudence long asleep and the wind screaming its old complaint against the shutters, that Nate finally opened his father's trunk. He had carried it with him since Texas, he'd told Eliza once, though he'd said little more of it, a locked chest of scarred cedar, his father's initials burned into the lid. E.C. Elias Calloway had been dead 11 years, and in all that time, by Nate's own quiet admission, the trunk had never once been opened. "Why now?" Eliza asked, watching him work the old lock with a bent nail by firelight, the fire throwing his shadow long against the wall. Nate didn't answer right away. He turned the nail slow, patient, the way he did everything. "Man carries a thing long enough," he said finally. "Starts to feel like carrying it's the same as facing it. It isn't." He glanced at her, something unguarded crossing his face for just a moment. "Reckon I've been carrying this one a long while." The lock gave with a small, tired click, as though it too had been waiting a decade to be asked properly. Inside lay a surveyor's kit gone to rust, brass fittings dulled with age, a folded set of territorial maps yellowed and crease-soft as cloth from handling long before Nate had ever touched them. Beneath the maps, At the very bottom lay a single letter, sealed in wax gone brittle and cracked at its edges, addressed in a careful, deliberate hand that had clearly taken its time with every stroke. To be delivered to the Hartley family, Cedar Ridge, when the need arises. Nate went very still. He stared at the letter a long moment, thumb tracing the wax seal without breaking it, and something moved behind his eyes that Eliza had not seen there before. Not grief exactly, but the particular stillness of a man realizing the ground beneath him was not quite what he'd believed it to be. Eliza Calloway, Eliza said softly, reading the name scrawled at the letter's corner. Her own, voice gone quiet with something she couldn't yet name. Your father surveyed here, in Cedar Ridge? Territorial survey, near 30 years back. Nate's voice had gone careful, distant, a man picking his way across ice he wasn't sure would hold. Before I was old enough to remember much of it, he never spoke on his surveying work. Not once that I recall. He looked up at her, and outside the wind threw another fistful of snow against the glass like something demanding to be let in. Eliza, I don't know what's in this, but addressed the way it is, I don't think it's nothing. He did not open it that night. He turned it over once more in his hands, as if weighing whether 10 more minutes of not knowing might be worth the peace of it, then set it back among the maps, and closed the trunk's lid soft as closing a door on a room he wasn't ready to enter. Neither of them spoke of it again before the past thawed, though Eliza lay awake long after the fire had burned to embers, listening to the wind worry at the shutters, wondering what a dead surveyor and a sealed letter could possibly have to do with a creek running dry along her father's fence line. She would not have long to wonder. Nate has finally opened the one thing his father left behind, and what's sealed inside that letter is about to change everything for Eliza and the whole town of Cedar Ridge. If you've ever believed a quiet heart could still be waiting for its moment, you won't want to miss where this goes next. Tell us in the comments what you think that letter says. We always love reading your guesses, and if frontier love stories like this one speak to you, subscribe to Paintbrush Prairie so you never miss the next chapter of Eliza and Nate's story. There's more coming. Stay with us. The Bridger Pass opened again in the second week of April, and with it came the thaw that mattered most to Cedar Ridge. Not the melt of snow off the peaks, but the territorial land agent's annual ride through the valley, the one date every rancher in the county kept nailed to memory. Water rights along Willow Creek were confirmed each spring when the agent passed through, recorded fresh in the territorial ledger at the land office in town. Whatever stood on paper by the time he rode out again would stand, in practice, for another year. Silas Grady understood the calendar as well as anyone. Better, perhaps, since he'd spent the whole winter arranging for it to work in his favor. Eliza felt the pressure of it settle over the farm like a held breath. Dutch Malone's visits grew more frequent and less patient, each one carrying some fresh variation of the same demand. Sign over the North 40. Formalize what the diverted creek had already begun to steal. And through it all, Nate said nothing more of the letter in his father's trunk. That silence, more than anything, was what finally undid her patience. She found the trunk open one afternoon in early April, Nate out mending fence. Along the south line, the letter itself, lying loose atop the maps where he'd left it. The wax seal broken at last. The pages within creased from reading and rereading. Eliza told herself she only meant to close the lid. She read 3 lines before she could stop herself, and 3 lines were enough. I have refused Augustus Grady's offer regarding the boundary survey. The line I have recorded is the true line, whatever price that costs me. Should trouble come to the Hartley family on account of this water in years hence, this letter and the enclosed map will set the record right. Eliza Calloway had known. Eliza Calloway had drawn the true boundary of Willow Creek 30 years past, had refused a bribe to move it, and had left the proof of it sealed in a trunk his own son had carried for 11 years without opening. And Nate had read it, had known for days now by the state of that broken seal, and had said nothing to her at all. She was still standing there, letter in hand, when he came in from the fence line, and the look on her face told him everything before either of them spoke a word. "You read it," Eliza said. It was not a question. 4 days back. Nate's jaw was tight, his hat still in his hand, dust from the fence line still on his shirt. "I was working out how to tell you without it sounding like—" "Like what, Nate?" Her voice had gone low and hard, the particular quiet of a woman who has learned that anger shown too plainly gets called hysteria by men who'd rather not answer for its cause. "Like you'd been sitting on proof that could save this farm, and decided I didn't need to know it yet. Like I was using it." The words came out rougher than he'd meant them, and he seemed to hear that himself, and softened nothing for it. "Eliza, a man rides in, courts you all winter, and it turns out his dead father's the one thing standing between you and Grady's whole scheme. You think that doesn't look exactly like what half this town already whispers about me? That I came sniffing after Hartley land, same as I came sniffing after you? I never thought that. I thought it. Enough for both of us some nights." He set his hat down slow, like the weight of it had grown considerable. "I wanted to be sure what I felt for you didn't have one single thread tied to what's in that letter. Wanted you to be sure of it too, before I ever laid it on the table." It was, Eliza would come to understand later, exactly the kind of reasoning a quiet man gave for a silence that had cost them both something, regardless of its good intentions. She did not say so then. She only folded the letter closed along its worn crease, set it back on the trunk's lid, and walked out to the porch without another word, leaving Nate standing alone in the lamplight with his father's proof and his own poor timing for company. They did not speak of it again for 3 days. 3 days of separate chores and short nods across the yard, the particular cold that settles between two people who have not quite quarreled and have not quite made peace either. It was Grady who ended the silence for them in his own fashion. Dutch Malone rode up the Hartley lane on the 4th morning with 6 Circle G men behind him, instead of 2, and no offer paper in his saddlebag at all. He carried instead a length of new-cut fence wire and an ultimatum plain enough that even Charlie, watching from the barn door, understood it without needing the words explained. "Mr. Grady's through waiting on reasonable," Dutch said, not bothering to soften it now. "Creek's getting fenced along the whole boundary line, effective today. You want water for your stock come the spring drive, Miss Hartley. There's exactly 1 paper left worth signing, and exactly until sundown tomorrow to sign it." He did not wait for her answer. He turned his horse and rode for the ridge line, his men falling in behind him, leaving Eliza standing in her own yard with a sundown deadline hanging over her head and a letter 30 years old, sitting unused in a trunk not 6 feet from where she stood. She looked at Nate across the yard. He looked back at her, and whatever had stood between them these 3 days seemed, of a sudden, considerably smaller than what was riding toward them now. "Tomorrow, then," she said. "Tomorrow," Nate agreed, and went to find the letter. Sundown came to Cedar Ridge the next evening, dressed in the same gold light it always wore, indifferent to the fact that a woman's whole living hung on what happened before it faded. Silas Grady rode up the Hartley lane himself this time, flanked by Dutch Malone and 4 Circle G hands, with the confidence of a man who had never needed to ride anywhere twice to get what he wanted. Gray now at the temples, he still carried his father's old certainty that Circle G land had a way of growing wider whenever a Grady willed it so. "Miss Hartley." Grady didn't dismount either, same as Dutch never had. He held the paper out from his saddle like a man offering a kindness. "Sign, and there's water for your stock come the spring drive. Don't, and I expect you'll find the creek runs considerably drier by morning than it does tonight." Eliza stood on her own porch steps with Charlie half hidden behind her skirts and Prudence's hand gripping the doorframe for balance, and she did not reach for the paper. "The Hartley line has stood since before your father's boots ever touched this valley, Mr. Grady," she said. "It'll stand tonight the same." Grady's smile was the practiced kind, patient as a man who has heard defiance before and watched it fold every time. "Sentiment's a fine thing, Miss Hartley. Doesn't water cattle." It was then that Nate stepped out from beside the barn, unhurried, and walked himself directly between Eliza and the 6 mounted men, the way he had stepped his horse between Dutch and the porch rail months before, not with his hand near his gun belt, not with a word, raised in anger, simply placing himself where he needed to be and letting that be answer enough. "Evening, Grady," Nate said. Something shifted in Grady's face at the sight of him. Not recognition exactly, but the particular unease of a man realizing a piece he'd dismissed from the board had wandered back onto it uninvited. "Calloway, didn't figure Circle G's old help for the type to go looking for more trouble than he's already found." "Wasn't looking for trouble." Nate reached into his coat, slow and plain so that no man watching could mistake the motion for anything but what it was, and drew out a folded set of papers gone soft and yellow with 30 years of keeping. "Was looking for the truth, same as my father was. The last time a Grady rode up, wanting a boundary line moved for his own convenience." Dutch's horse shifted uneasily beneath him. Grady's jaw set hard. "Elias Calloway surveyed this territory in '55. Nate went on, voice carrying flat and even across the yard, the way a man speaks when he has waited a long while to say a true thing out loud. "Your father offered him money to move the Willow Creek boundary onto Hartley land. My father refused him, recorded the true line, and wrote down exactly what was offered and by whom, sealed it, addressed to whichever Hartley might need it someday. I expect that's near 30 years he's been waiting on this evening, Grady, same as you've been waiting to finish what your father started." He held the map out, not to Grady, but toward the road. Toward the rider Eliza had not noticed until that moment, coming up the lane at an easy trot, badge catching the last of the sundown light. Marshal Wyatt Coleman had ridden out from town that same afternoon on Nate's message, carried by Charlie at a dead run 3 hours prior, though Eliza would not learn the particulars until later. The marshal drew rein at the edge of the yard, taking in the scene with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who never drew a conclusion before he'd seen the whole of a thing. "Elias Calloway's survey is a matter of territorial record, filed the same year he drew it," Coleman said, once Nate had passed the papers up to him and he'd spent a long, silent minute studying the ink. "I rode past the land office on my way out here and had the clerk pull the original filing on account of the message I received." He looked at Grady now, and there was nothing patient left in his expression at all. "Original filing shows the same boundary line as this map, Silas. Same line your outfit's fence has been sitting on the wrong side of since November." "That letter's nothing but an old man's grudge," Grady said, though his voice had lost the certainty it carried at the top of the lane. "Territorial record doesn't go stale, Grady. It just sits waiting on somebody honest enough to ask for it." Coleman folded the map back with a care that suggested he understood exactly what it was worth. "Your father tried to buy a line. That wasn't his to buy. And Elias Calloway told him no, and wrote it down for the day some Grady tried it again. That day's today. I'll be riding your fence line myself come morning, and every foot of wire sitting on Hartley waters coming down, or you'll answer to the territorial court for theft of a recorded easement. And I expect a court might take some interest, too, in how long Circle G's been squeezing a widow woman's stock water on the strength of a bribe that failed 30 years back." For one long moment, nobody in the yard moved at all. Grady looked at the marshal, and at Nate standing steady in front of the porch, and at Eliza standing steadier still behind him. and something in his face, the certainty that had carried him up that lane an hour before, simply gave way, the way a fence gives way when the post beneath it has already rotted through. "This isn't finished," Grady said low, though everyone in the yard understood it for the empty thing it was. "It's finished. Tonight, Silas," Coleman said. "Whatever you make of tomorrow is your own affair." Grady turned his horse without another word, and Dutch and the rest fell in behind him, riding back up the lane the same way they'd come, though considerably less certain of the ground beneath them than they had been an hour before. The sun had nearly gone by the time the last of them cleared the ridge, and the yard settled into the particular hush that follows a storm that has, against all early signs, passed the house by, rather than through it. Charlie let out a breath he'd clearly been holding the whole while. Prudence's hand loosened its grip on the doorframe. Eliza looked at Nate, standing there in the last gold light with his father's 30-year silence finally spoken aloud, and found she had nothing clever left to say at all. "You might have told me the marshal was riding out," she said instead. "Didn't know for certain he'd make it before sundown." Nate turned to face her fully now, some of the day's tension easing out of his shoulders at last. Seemed like the kind of thing better shown than promised. It was, Eliza thought, exactly like him, to let the proof arrive instead of the assurance, and trust that when it came, it would be enough. It was. Marshal Coleman kept his word about riding the fence line come morning, and Cedar Ridge talked of little else for a month. Every rod of wire Circle G had strung along Willow Creek came down within the week, torn out by Grady's own hands under the marshal's watching eye, since no man in the territory would hire on to dismantle fence built to steal a neighbor's water, once the story of it had made the rounds of the mercantile. The territorial court took up the matter of the recorded easement that spring, and while Silas Grady kept his ranch and his name, he kept precious little else of the standing he'd carried into that yard the night the marshal rode up. Men who had once tipped their hats to him on the street now tipped them a beat slower, and asked after his father's old dealings with a curiosity that was not kindness. The investigation into 30 years of quiet boundary disputes up and down the valley was by all accounts only just beginning, and would occupy the territorial land office considerably longer than one spring thaw. Eliza Rose Hartley found herself, in the months that followed, the subject of a different kind of talk entirely. It started small, Mrs. Pruitt, of all people, stopping her outside the general store to ask, with something almost like deference, whether the Hartley herd had recovered well over the season. It grew from there. The woman who had been called quiet, called past her season, called every unkind thing a small town could invent for a female who managed alone, was quietly recast in Cedar Ridge's estimation as a woman who had stood her ground against Silas Grady himself and not blinked. Nobody apologized outright for 6 years of whispering. Cedar Ridge was not built for outright apologies. But the whispering stopped, and in its place came a different sort of attention. Invitations to sewing circles she'd never before been asked to join, nods of genuine respect from men who'd once looked past her at church, as though a woman running her own farm were an oversight needing correction. Nate stayed on through that summer and the one after, no longer as a drifting hand between jobs, but as a fixture of the Hartley place so complete that Charlie had long since stopped introducing him as anything other than Nate, plain and settled, the way a boy speaks of someone who has simply always been there. He never did take work with Circle G again, nor needed to. Word of the water rights case had traveled far enough that ranches twice the size of the Hartley place sent riders asking after the man who'd broken his colt so gentle and stood so steady against 6 mounted men without ever reaching for his gun. It was the following autumn at the harvest social held, once more in the churchyard behind the little white church, that Cedar Ridge witnessed the second half of what it had first witnessed a year before. The tables were dressed the same, gingham and lantern light, the same smell of wood smoke and cinnamon settling over the yard as the evening came on blue and gold. Eliza set her pie among the others. Dried apple again, same as always. Some things a woman didn't see reason to change, and felt none of the old prickle of eyes turning away from her. This year they turned toward her and stayed. Nate found her by the punch table, same as he had a year before, hat in his hand, dust from the road on his boots, though he'd ridden no further than the Hartley lane that morning. "Miss Hartley," he said, loud enough that half the yard turned to listen, the way half the yard had turned to listen once before. "Reckon I asked you to supper the first night I ever saw you standing in this churchyard, and you were kind enough to say yes to a stranger. Nobody in this town had any business trusting." "I recall it," Eliza said, and found she could not keep the smile from her voice. "I've got a good deal less to offer you now than most men would think proper to ask with," Nate said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite steady for the first time since she'd known him. "No ranch of my own. No name in this territory but the one my father left me, and what little good that's done besides clearing your family's water rights. But I've got 2 hands that don't mind hard work, and a horse, and I find I don't much care to spend another season anywhere Eliza Hartley isn't." He knelt then, in front of the whole gathered churchyard, in front of Mrs. Pruitt and the sewing circle, and Charlie grinning, fit to split his face, and Prudence dabbing at her blind eyes with a corner of her shawl, and asked her the question that needed no dramatic staging at all, coming as it did from a man who had spent a whole year proving the answer, through fence posts and gaskets and a wooden horse left on a windowsill, rather than through any words he might have chosen instead. Eliza Rose Hartley, who had once been called quiet, called Spinster, called past her season by half the town of Cedar Ridge, looked down at Nathaniel Calloway kneeling in the churchyard grass with his father's 30-year silence finally spoken, and his own future laid open and plain before her, and answered him the same way she'd answered a stranger's supper invitation a year before, clear enough for the whole yard to catch, and this time without one whisper rising up to meet it. "I reckon I would, Mr. Calloway." It is worth pausing here. An old man telling this story might say, on the particular arithmetic of a life like Eliza's, and a courtship like Nate's. Neither of them had ever made a single grand gesture that Cedar Ridge could point to and call the reason. There was no speech that turned the tide, no single dramatic ride that saved the farm, outright. There was only a pump fixed without being asked, a fence mended, a colt gentled, a letter carried 11 years before it was ever opened, and a man who chose again and again, in the smallest and least noticed hours of a hard winter, to stand where he was needed rather than say what he felt. It was Elias Calloway's quiet refusal of a bribe 30 years gone, too, that finally came due. Proof that an honest man's small, stubborn choice can outlast his own lifetime, can cross a generation, and settle a debt he never lived to see collected. That is how it goes, more often than the story songs would have you believe. Not with thunder, but with small decisions, made honestly, in rooms nobody else is watching, and left, like a letter in a locked trunk, to speak for themselves whenever the need finally arises. Silas Grady lived out his years on a Circle G considerably smaller in reputation than it had been, and never again tried to move a boundary line that wasn't his. Willow Creek ran full and clear past the Hartley fence every spring after, watering stock the same as it had for Eliza's grandfather and his father before him. Charlie grew into a young man who still kept a whittled bay mare on his windowsill long after he'd outgrown toys, because some gifts aren't given to be played with, but to be remembered by. And Cedar Ridge in time stopped telling the story of the quiet spinster altogether, and told instead the story of the woman who stood her ground, and the drifter who stood beside her, and the truth that outlasted every whisper raised against it. So the light goes down easy over Cedar Ridge tonight, Same gold and blue it's always worn. And I reckon that's as fine a place as any to leave two people who found their second chance in a churchyard and held on to it. Until the next trail crosses ours, friend, ride easy and mind the quiet ones. They're carrying more than most folks ever bother to notice.